Recently, I came across this quote by Garth Ennis, where he describes Captain America as borderline offensive, and even suggesting that he's an insult to the memory of World War II veterans. And while I think criticizing the glorification of war is a pretty interesting perspective, I think Captain America is just the wrong hill to die on. He was created before the US even entered the war, so it's not purely propaganda. His original writer and artist, Jack Kirby, was a World War II vet who even served in the European theater. And even during World War II, he was pretty popular with active duty servicemen. Captain America White both covers the World War II era, but was written in 2016. As a result, it has the same level of hindsight that Ennis does, so I wanted to evaluate his criticism through the source material. But to my surprise, ironically, I think Captain America White misses the point of its message in pretty much the same way that Garth Ennis did. And unfortunately, it comes out to be the weakest piece of work from my favorite creative duo. Jeph Loeb and Tim Sale's Color series is all about stripping all of these heroes back to their essentials, really focusing on their humanity. And as I mentioned, the entire story is pretty much just Cap's first mission in World War II with some future narration sprinkled in. Unlike Holt Gray, present-day Captain America is pretty much only a storyteller. There's not really any sort of contemporary plot. All of that time and effort is rerouted into us seeing Cap and Bucky's very first mission in Nazi-occupied France. Now, to my fellow movie-only connoisseurs, Bucky is 16, and not like a Riverdale 16, like an actual 16-year-old. I understand now that that is authentic, but I cannot underestimate to you how much this just undermines any level of seriousness. World War II should just be the easiest conflict possible to establish clear, important stakes. But when I just turn the page and see this fucking kid running around, it makes me wish that they changed his character design or maybe the story tone as a whole. It also doesn't help, and this pains me to say, it's probably the weakest Tim Sale art I've seen so far. I think the style he's going for is kind of like a World War II propaganda poster, which sounds cool, but it quickly grows tiring. The panel design is okay, but the characters, they just don't emote enough. Their faces are just always so stiff. And he does these like dark, kind of unposed panels a lot, and I almost would call some of them pretty ugly. Don't get me wrong, there are some classic vintage Sale moments, but I think the choice to have most of this comic happen at night does really hurt the art direction as a whole. I really like Red Skull's design, but I guess it was almost because I was so desperate to latch onto something. So what about the story? Bucky and Cap's relationship to me was always like a brotherly one. And while Bucky is kind of written as like this little runt trying to make a name for themselves, like, DW or Ahsoka, which again does not fit this setting, Captain America is written more like a father figure, and their interpersonal dynamic of like trying to make sense in this war, I find very uncompelling. Their relationship is consumed by present-day Cap's grief over Bucky's death, that there's not really much time to like have an arc about trust or friendship. And although their relationship is creatively messy, Steve Rogers in this is straight up not a compelling protagonist. This is the real cardinal sin of this story. Captain America is honestly pretty mean, and even if it's out of a sense of like protection for Bucky or whomever, he doesn't hesitate to fight American soldiers or like throw a guy out of a window. You could make the argument that these are like early career flaws that he has to work through, but the themes and arc that I'm gonna go into have very little to do with this. If the villains weren't literal Nazis, I don't even think I would really care about this conflict. Ultimately, this is the standard World War II stuff that you have heard like 100 times. Unfortunately, there is a distinct lack of originality or humanity in this plot. I think this is far from a bad comic, but the thing that upsets me the most, given how much I love this creative team, is just how safe it feels. I think a lot of people who are very into comics would call these two creators safe, and I think similarly to like a Steven Spielberg, people call them safe because they're so prevalent in casual settings. But I would argue their stories are incredibly bold, just in a different way than your Grant Morrison's or Stanley Kubrick's. So much of their tales are about these core experiences that any person can relate to. Loss and friendship should be natural complements to a story like this, and are even themes I've seen them do well in the past. But unfortunately, the execution of those themes is incredibly shallow. For example, there's this sequence where Bucky is trying to save Cap from sinking to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, and the only way he can have the strength to bring him back up is if he cuts off his shield. And it's supposed to be this like symbolize people over things type of message. I don't know, I thought that he should have cut the shield and let Cap drown to save the shield. But there's no conflict here. Like, there's no thought in his or the reader's mind of like, oh, let me save this shield over Captain America. And like, whatever, that's a hollow metaphor, but at least it is a metaphor, until this Aquaman guy fetches the shield, gives it back to Cap, which is like, okay, totally nullifies this whole experience. But that's his only appearance in the entire story, which is just to retcon the one time where there's supposed to be this metaphor. And my lawyer is telling me I need to inform you that Nick Fury is here, along with some other soldiers, and they are characters, I guess. The most obvious retcon I would do is get rid of anybody not named Cap, Bucky, or Red Skull. What should be this intimate moment of bonding between these two characters is just spoiled by this generic military man jargon. And don't get me wrong, I have a lot of stories that I really like of that genre, but in here, these two visions do not mesh well. So let's come back to where we started. Garth Ennis. Welcome back to another episode of Comic Talks about touchy moral subjects that he has no authority or expertise on. I think both Ennis and Loeb are viewing Cap in a very post-Vietnam lens. Captain America White really wants to convince you that it's a morally ambiguous story. The most obvious example is when our heroes meet some members of the French resistance who are trying to rebel against the Nazi occupation. And Cap gets like chewed out for like, coming in, playing dress up, trying to liberate France. And it ends with this monologue that's like, only the French can liberate France. If you put that in nearly any other American conflict, Vietnam, Iraq, even Afghanistan, that's extremely poignant. But without dismissing the very real number of war crimes the Allied powers committed, World War II is just historically different. The US was not invading France, and I find the idea that the French rebels would be saying this about Captain America incredibly unconvincing. They really want you to question, is Captain America really helping? Is he just purely a symbol? Does he hide the cost of war? That's why they chose white as the color theme. And I think Ennis likewise equates Captain America falsely with pure propaganda. But Captain America was not created to say America is right. Captain America was created to say that Nazism is evil and should be opposed, which makes Ennis's criticism, while well-meaning, fall extremely flat. Fundamentally, Captain America White and Garth Ennis want to evaluate Steve through the faithfulness of the lived experiences of soldiers. Ennis concludes that it's a trivialization, while Loeb turns the criticism inwards. But I want to push back on that assumption. Veterans already know the horrors of war, so I argue Steve represents the ideals worth fighting a war for, and World War II is the most powerful example of that. I would even go so far as to say that Captain America is written more for veterans than civilians. If you were someone like Jack Kirby and you fought and witnessed some of the most bloody battles in the largest war in human history. I think a story reminding you about the horrors would be the last thing you'd want to read. If I was a soldier at the time, I would want to read a story that reminds me why I'm fighting. I hesitate to say any of the critiques are flat out wrong, but I do think they're evaluating him a little bit too literally. Ask Captain America to embody ideals, he's propaganda. Ask him to depict reality, he betrays the soldiers who lived it. Steve Rogers feels condemned for being the story he was never meant to tell. It's a war that Captain America just can't win. And as a result, I feel very little towards this depiction of the character. I think there is a very important distinction between the overall glorification of war, bad, and honoring or even sometimes celebrating the individual acts of valor that military people do, which is, I'm not going to say 100% good, but it's usually good. My last bit of criticism is the entire story Captain America is just grieving over the fact he could not save Bucky. So many times you get dialogue like, I loved him, he was my best friend, until he died. But then they don't even show the moment where Cap fails to save Bucky, making all of this buildup just incredibly unfulfilling. You all know that there is one more thing that we have to do. We have to give this comic a rating. First of all, thank you to everybody who suggested I read this. Even though I didn't like the comic, I still found it very interesting to read. So if you want to influence my other ideas, drop me a comment. I try to reply to every single one. If you want more Captain America content, I briefly covered him in my Daredevil Born Again video, so go check that out. We're coming back to Spider-Man next time, so be sure to subscribe if you want to see what dastardly take I give next. Unfortunately, this is Loeb Sale's first real miss for me. Honestly, I did not fall in love with any individual piece of this comic, so I am going to give Captain America White a 4 out of 10. Have a good one. Peace.